Texas. May 19th, 1836, Fort Parker. A 17-year-old girl watches her father-in-law fall. Her mother-in-law is struck down and left in the dirt. Before she can scream, warriors seize her and throw her onto a horse. She is 6 months pregnant. Her name is Rachel Plummer. And for the next 21 months, she will endure things so unbearable that even years later, safe in her father's home, she refuses to describe them fully. In her own published memoir, she writes only this: "To narrate their treatment would only add to my present distress, for it is with feelings of the deepest mortification that I think of it, much less speak or write of it." Rachel Plummer was not alone. During the 1800s, across the American Southwest, hundreds of women were taken from frontier settlements. Some were ransomed back to their families after months or years of negotiation. Some escaped during moments of chaos and walked hundreds of miles back to civilization. And the ones who did return carried stories that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Stories they could barely bring themselves to tell. Stories that 19th century newspapers, papers that freely printed every gruesome detail of public hangings, sometimes refused to publish in full. This is not frontier legend. These are documented accounts, court testimonies given under oath, memoirs written by the survivors themselves, sold to thousands who wanted to know what really happened out there in the wilderness. I am crown and dagger, and here we do not look away. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, you support this channel with a like and subscribe. Because what comes next, your teacher never mentioned. So let's begin. Where it always began. The stories that survived were never told all at once, not because they were forgotten, but because they were difficult to carry, and even more difficult to explain to those who had never lived inside a world where survival required the slow reshaping of the self. Because captivity in the Comanche world was not a single moment of terror frozen in time. It was a process, one that unfolded over days, months, and sometimes years, altering identity piece by piece until the past became distant and the future uncertain. And this uncertainty was not accidental. It was the environment in which captives were expected to adapt, because adaptation was the difference between enduring and disappearing. And long before historians attempted to categorize these experiences, the women who lived them understood something far more immediate. That captivity was not defined solely by restraint or removal, but by the constant demand to learn new rules quickly, rules that governed behavior, silence, movement, and belonging. And these rules were enforced not always through visible punishment, but through expectation, observation, and the ever-present understanding that survival depended on cooperation, and cooperation required comprehension, and comprehension required attention, and attention was exhausting because nothing could be taken for granted. Not language, not gesture, not intention. And this relentless vigilance shaped every moment, making time feel distorted because days blended together under the weight of adjustment. And memory became both refuge and burden, a reminder of who one had been and a distraction from who one needed to become in order to endure. And this tension defined captivity more than any single act, because it forced a constant negotiation between resistance and adaptation, between holding on to identity and allowing it to change. And this negotiation was deeply personal, varying from woman to woman, because captivity did not erase individuality immediately. It tested it, stretched it, and in some cases, slowly reconfigured it. And this is why the experiences that emerged were complex, layered, and often misunderstood by those who later tried to reduce them to simple narratives of cruelty or resilience. Because simplicity fails to capture the psychological landscape of living inside an unfamiliar world where the rules of survival were written by others and rewritten frequently, and where meaning was communicated through behavior as much as through words. and for many women, the initial shock of removal gave way not to constant fear, but to a more unsettling state of alertness, because alertness requires engagement, and engagement implies participation, and participation blurred the boundaries between captive and community in ways that were difficult to reconcile, because belonging, even partial or conditional, complicated the idea of captivity itself. And this complication was one of the most difficult aspects to articulate later, because it challenged the expectation that captivity must be defined solely by suffering, when in reality it was often defined by adaptation, negotiation, and the gradual learning of how to exist within a system that did not recognize the past that had shaped them. And this learning process began immediately, as women were forced to observe closely, to understand social hierarchies, roles, and expectations without instruction, because instruction was rare, and misunderstanding carried consequences, not always immediate but cumulative, because repeated errors signaled unwillingness or inability to adapt, and adaptation was valued above all else, not as a moral judgment, but as a practical necessity. And this emphasis shaped interactions profoundly because it rewarded attentiveness, compliance, and flexibility, while discouraging overt resistance. And this discouragement was often subtle, expressed through withdrawal of assistance, increased scrutiny, or isolation rather than direct confrontation. And these methods were effective precisely because they required the captive to interpret signals correctly, reinforcing the need to pay constant attention. And this constant attention reshaped cognition, narrowing focus to immediate surroundings, immediate needs, immediate expectations, because thinking too far ahead was destabilizing, and thinking too far back was painful. And so many women learned to live within a compressed sense of time, where survival was measured day by day, adjustment by adjustment, and this temporal compression altered perception, making the extraordinary feel routine and the routine feel essential. And within this framework, identity became fluid, not because it was erased, but because it was recontextualized, as women learned new names, new roles, new ways of moving through space. And these changes were not always imposed violently. They were often integrated gradually through repetition and reinforcement until they felt familiar. And familiarity in such circumstances was both relief and loss, because it made survival easier while distancing the captive from the person they once were. And this distance grew quietly, rarely acknowledged, because acknowledging it required confronting grief. And grief was destabilizing in an environment where stability was achieved through adaptation. And this is why many accounts emphasize endurance rather than emotion, because emotion threatened equilibrium, and equilibrium was necessary to continue. And as women navigated this new reality, they encountered a social world that operated according to values different from those they had known. Values that emphasized communal responsibility, kinship ties, and reciprocal obligation. And understanding these values was essential because behavior was interpreted through this lens, and misalignment could be perceived as disrespect or unwillingness to integrate. And integration, however partial, was often the safest path. And this safety was conditional, dependent on continued compliance and attentiveness, creating a precarious balance that required constant maintenance. And this maintenance shaped behavior deeply, encouraging silence in some moments, participation in others, and careful calibration of response, because every interaction carried meaning, and meaning carried consequence. And over time, this careful calibration became habitual, altering posture, speech, and even thought, because habits formed under pressure tend to persist, and this persistence explains why the effects of captivity often extended far beyond its duration, shaping lives long after physical freedom was restored. And this enduring impact is what makes these stories so unsettling, because they reveal how environments can reshape individuals not through spectacle or brutality alone, but through sustained psychological pressure, cultural immersion, and the constant demand to adapt. And as this narrative continues, the layers of this experience become clearer, revealing not only what women endured, but how endurance itself required transformation, and how that transformation complicated every attempt to return, to remember, and to explain. Leaving behind stories that resist simplification, stories that speak less about a single moment of suffering, and more about the long, quiet process of surviving inside a world that demanded change as the price of continued existence. As time passed and the initial shock softened into something more manageable, the true weight of captivity revealed itself not through constant fear, but through repetition, because repetition is what reshapes perception, and perception determines survival. And for many women, the days began to follow patterns that were unfamiliar yet increasingly predictable. Patterns that demanded participation rather than resistance, because resistance drew attention and attention carried risk, while participation offered a measure of stability, and stability, even when fragile, was valuable. Because it reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was exhausting, and this exhaustion shaped decision-making, encouraging choices that prioritized immediate safety over long-term ideals. And these choices were rarely framed as surrender. They were framed as practicality, because practicality allowed women to justify adaptation without feeling they had abandoned themselves. And this internal negotiation became a constant companion, influencing how they interpreted every interaction, every instruction, every expectation, because meaning was rarely stated outright. It was implied, observed, inferred, and learning to read these implications became essential because misunderstanding them could result in isolation. And isolation was one of the most destabilizing experiences a captive could face, not because it was dramatic, but because it removed access to information, and information was power, and power, even in small amounts, made life more predictable, and predictability was a form of relief, and this relief was often found in routine, in learning tasks, responsibilities, and roles that provided structure to the day, because structure gave time a shape, and shaped time felt survivable. And within these routines, women learned the rhythms of a society that valued resilience, adaptability, and contribution. And contribution became a key factor in how captives were perceived, because usefulness offered a form of protection, and protection, however conditional, was meaningful because it reduced exposure to scrutiny, and scrutiny was relentless in an environment where behavior signaled intention, and intention was constantly evaluated. And this evaluation did not stop once adaptation began. It intensified, because adaptation raised expectations, and raised expectations narrowed tolerance for error, creating a paradox where success increased pressure rather than alleviating it. And navigating this paradox required constant awareness, because complacency could be misinterpreted as disrespect, and misunderstanding could lead to consequences that were rarely explained in advance, reinforcing the need for vigilance. And this vigilance altered how women experienced themselves, because it required suppressing spontaneous reactions in favor of calculated responses. And calculation became second nature, influencing speech patterns, body language, and emotional expression, because emotion, when displayed incorrectly, could be misread. A misinterpretation carried risk. And so emotional restraint was learned quickly, not because emotion disappeared, but because it was redirected inward, contained, managed, and containment became a survival skill, one that allowed women to endure without drawing attention, and this inward turn had lasting effects, because emotions that are consistently contained tend to resurface later in unexpected ways, shaping memory, identity, and sense of self long after the immediate threat has passed. And this delayed impact is one reason why accounts of captivity often sound restrained, factual, or fragmented, because language struggles to capture experiences that were survived through suppression rather than expression. And as women continued to live within this environment, they encountered moments of complexity that challenged simple narratives of victimhood or resistance. Moments where kindness and cruelty coexisted, where assistance was offered alongside expectation, and where relationships formed under conditions that were neither fully voluntary nor entirely imposed. And these relationships complicated memory because they blurred moral boundaries, making it difficult to categorize experiences cleanly. And this difficulty persisted long after captivity ended, because returning to a society that expected clear stories of suffering often meant editing out nuance, simplifying experiences to fit familiar frameworks, and this simplification created its own form of isolation because it left little room to discuss the psychological adaptations that had made survival possible, and these adaptations were often misunderstood, judged, or dismissed, reinforcing silence. And silence compounded the long-term effects of captivity because unspoken experiences tend to remain unresolved, shaping behavior indirectly. And this unresolved tension was evident in how many women struggled to reintegrate, not because they had forgotten their previous lives, but because their sense of normal had been altered, recalibrated by years of living under different expectations. And this recalibration affected everything from social interaction to decision-making, because habits formed under pressure do not dissolve easily. And pressure had been constant, shaping responses at a fundamental level. And this persistence explains why captivity cannot be understood solely by examining its duration or conditions, because its true impact lies in how it reshaped perception, teaching women to prioritize adaptability, caution, and observation in ways that did not simply disappear once physical freedom was restored. And this reshaping was neither total nor uniform. It varied widely depending on individual temperament, circumstances, and the specific environments women encountered. But its presence was undeniable, leaving traces that influenced lives long after the period of captivity had ended. And these traces were often mistaken for weakness or compliance by observers who did not understand the context in which they were formed. And this misunderstanding added another layer of burden, because it required women to navigate judgment as well as memory. And judgment often demanded clear narratives of endurance or suffering, leaving little space for ambiguity. And ambiguity was central to their experience, because captivity had forced them to live within contradictions, to find stability within instability, and to survive through change rather than resistance alone. And acknowledging this complexity challenges comfortable assumptions about strength, resilience, and identity, because it reveals that survival is not always heroic or dramatic. It is often quiet, adaptive, and deeply unsettling. And as the narrative continues, these themes become more pronounced, illustrating how captivity extended beyond physical boundaries into the realm of thought, habit, and memory, shaping lives in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. And this enduring influence is what makes the story of women in Comanche captivity so difficult to confront, because it forces us to reckon not only with what was endured, but with how endurance itself required transformation, and how that transformation complicated every attempt to return to a previous self, leaving behind lives that continued forward, carrying the imprint of a world that demanded change as the price of survival. And this imprint remained long after captivity ended, shaping identities, relationships, and memories in ways that resisted simplification, reminding us that the most profound impacts of such experiences are often invisible, carried quietly within those who lived through them, long after the circumstances that created them have faded into history.